Dr. Ann Burgess has spent more than 50 years inside the darkest cases in American history. She has sat across from Ted Bundy. She has interviewed John Wayne Gacy. She helped build the science of criminal profiling from the ground up inside the FBI, and her work became the foundation for the Netflix series Mindhunter. When a case lands in front of her, she does not speculate. She reads what the evidence is actually saying. And when she finished examining the details of the Nancy Guthrie case, the conclusion she reached was not what anyone expected. She said the house may not have been the actual crime scene at all. That is where this story begins. Not with a ransom note, not with a Bitcoin demand, not with the masked figure on the doorbell camera, but with the possibility that everything investigators were looking at was designed to be looked at, that the real crime had already happened somewhere else, and what was left behind at 4825 North Genemedas Drive in Tucson, Arizona, was a performance put there for them to find. But to understand why that conclusion matters, you have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was before any of this happened. Nancy Ellen Guthrie was 84 years old, and she had lived in the same house in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson for more than 50 years. She knew every corner of that property. She tended her garden. She went to her church every Sunday without fail. She had raised 3 children largely on her own after her husband died in a mining accident in Mexico when she was just 46 years old. By every account from the people who knew her, she was a woman of deep faith, steady routine, and quiet dignity. She also happened to be the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the anchor of NBC's Today Show, which meant that when Nancy vanished in the early hours of February 1, 2026, the story did not stay quiet for long. What investigators know about that evening is this. Nancy had dinner at the home of her daughter Annie and Annie's husband, Tommaso Chioni, who had been part of the Guthrie family for 20 years. Tommaso drove Nancy home at 9:48 that night. He walked her to the front door. He said he confirmed she was safely inside, then drove away. That was the last time anyone who has spoken publicly saw Nancy Guthrie. 3 hours and 57 minutes later, at 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera at Nancy's front door captured a masked figure approaching the porch. The figure was armed. He was wearing nitrile gloves. He was carrying a backpack, a $25 Ozark Trail Pack from Walmart, the kind you can buy in any sporting goods aisle in the country. He tapped the camera lens twice, calm and rhythmic, then used the foliage from a nearby potted plant to cover it completely. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker lost its sync with the bedside monitoring unit inside the house. The cardiac device implanted in her chest had been recording continuously, and in the minutes before it lost connection, it had logged a heart rate spike to 147 beats per minute, sustained elevated readings consistent with distress, and, according to reporting on the case, what appeared to be the pharmacological signature of a sedative compound entering her system. Her phone was still inside the house. Her medications were still on the kitchen counter. The specialized watch she wore to monitor her pacemaker was still on her nightstand. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie that night either did not know she needed those things to survive or did not care. That detail, according to Dr. Ann Burgess, tells you something specific about the person who planned this. It tells you there was no intention to keep her comfortable, no plan to negotiate a live exchange, and possibly no expectation that she would be alive long enough to need any of it. Now here is the part the news coverage kept moving past. After Tommaso dropped Nancy off at 9:48 that night, it was not police who discovered her missing the next morning. It was friends from her church who became concerned when they could not reach her. They called the family, and according to reporting on the case, the family then had approximately 1 hour inside that house before anyone called 911. 1 hour. in a house that was also a crime scene. Dr. Burgess, speaking on the record about this case, flagged that detail directly. She said that in a situation like this, the amount of information that can be altered, moved, or simply observed in 60 minutes inside a crime scene is significant. What the house looked like before that hour and what it looked like when law enforcement arrived, those are two different things, and there is no way to recover what was in between. By the time investigators processed the scene, what they found at the front door was a small amount of blood, two types of deposit, drops falling straight down with no directionality, and a finer mist nearby. Detective Phil Ramos, a former Las Vegas homicide investigator who analyzed footage of the blood, noted that the lack of any directional pattern meant whoever was bleeding was either standing still or being held in place. They were not walking. They were not moving under their own power. The ring camera had been removed from the front of the house. The Nest cameras, also present on the property, had been taken as well. What the people who took them apparently did not know is that the footage from those cameras had already uploaded to the cloud. The recordings existed, and they showed the masked figure, methodical and calm, moving through his steps like someone who had been told exactly what to do. And that is the question that Dr. Ann Burgess kept coming back to. That is the question that changes the entire shape of this case. Who told him? The man on that porch did not find Nancy Guthrie on his own. That is what Dr. Ann Burgess concluded after going through the details of this case, and she was precise about why. The camera positions, the gate, the layout of the property in the dark, the schedule, the specific window when Nancy would be home and alone, and when her most high-profile daughter would be on the other side of the world. None of that information is available to a stranger who drove past a house in the Catalina foothills one afternoon and decided to come back. That level of knowledge requires proximity. It requires time. It requires someone who had been inside that world long enough to understand how it worked from the inside. Burgess said it plainly. The person behind this had a comfort level with that home that is only possible for someone who knows the family. But before she got to who was behind it, she addressed the figure on the porch directly. And what she said about him is not what most people covering this case have focused on. Burgess, alongside Dr. Casey Jordan, built a specific profile of the man at the door. They believe he is young, somewhere around 27 to 28 years old. They believe he was local to Tucson when the crime occurred. They noted what Burgess described as an amateur quality to the way he moved through the scene. The holster on his body positioned incorrectly, the cheap Walmart backpack with reflective safety strips still attached, the choice of a potted plant to block a camera. She used the phrase, amateur hour, not to dismiss him, but to make a point. Because that amateur quality sits in direct contrast to the sophistication of everything else about this crime. The planning was not amateur. The timing was not amateur. The knowledge of that house, that family, and that schedule was not amateur. Which means, Burgess concluded, you are looking at two very different people operating inside one crime. One of them understood exactly what they were doing. The other one was following instructions. She called the planner the puppet master. So did Dr. Jordan, and they were specific about what kind of person fits that description. Someone with what Burgess characterized as a narcissistic and psychopathic personality structure. Someone who derives a quiet satisfaction from watching chaos unfold, who is likely following the news coverage, watching the press conferences, and feeling something close to pleasure at the scale of what they set in motion. Dr. Jordan put it simply, the internal voice of a person like this is, "Look what I can do." Now here is where this case takes a turn that reframes everything from part one, the ransom notes, the Bitcoin demand, the $6 million figure sent anonymously to TMZ and local Tucson media. Every analyst and investigator who has spoken publicly about this case has treated the ransom as the motive, as the reason Nancy was taken. But Dr. Ann Burgess looked at those notes and said something no one else had said clearly on camera. She said she does not believe the ransom was real. She said it plainly and without qualification. In her assessment, the ransom notes were either the work of an opportunistic person trying to exploit a high-profile situation, someone who had nothing to do with the crime itself, or they were deliberately placed to create a story for investigators to chase, to point the lens outward toward a financial motive, while the actual reason this happened sat safely out of frame. Consider the Bitcoin wallet where the $6 million demand was directed. The FBI sent a test amount to that address. As of day 100 of this investigation, not a single fraction of that amount had moved. The wallet has been completely silent since the moment it was created. That is not how a genuine kidnapper behaves. A person holding an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and demanding payment for her safe return does not ignore a test transaction. They respond. They negotiate. They prove she is alive. The silence from that wallet tells its own story, but the detail that investigators kept returning to, the one Burgess said may be the most important single piece of evidence in terms of understanding what actually happened, is the ransom note that Savannah Guthrie herself said felt different from the others. The one where the writer said something to the effect of, "We did not expect her heart to be that weak. We are sorry." Read that sentence again. That is not the language of a kidnapper managing a hostage. A kidnapper treats the hostage as the source of the money, as precious cargo that must be kept alive and deliverable. You do not write an apology about the physical condition of your leverage. You write that kind of sentence when something went wrong, when the plan changed because reality did not match what you expected when you arrived at that house. And that brings us to the number, the $6 million figure itself. Burgess and the investigators analyzing this case have pointed out that a stranger imagining the wealth of a national television anchor does not land on $6 million. A stranger dreams in round numbers: $10 million, $50 million, $100 million. The person who wrote $6 million knew something about what was actually liquid, what was actually accessible, what the real financial picture of that family looked like, not the one the public would assume from the outside. That number is not a guess. That number is insider knowledge. Which brings us back to the question Burgess kept asking throughout her analysis, the one that shapes the entire investigative framework of this case. Not who was at the door, not who sent the notes, but who could know that house the way this crime required someone to know it? Who had 20 years of access, 20 years of family dinners, 20 years of walking through those rooms and understanding in intimate detail how that family's life actually worked? The answer to that question is not a stranger. And what law enforcement did or failed to do in the critical first days of this investigation may have made it significantly harder to prove. The FBI was locked out of this investigation for nearly 4 days. That is not speculation. That is what FBI Director Kash Patel said publicly, that federal agents were not brought in until almost 4 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. 4 days while an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker, high blood pressure, and cardiac medication sitting untouched on her kitchen counter was somewhere unknown. The window when evidence is freshest, when witnesses remember details most clearly, when digital trails are easiest to follow, that window was closing, and the people with the most resources to work it were waiting outside. It gets worse. According to reporting on the case, the Pima County Sheriff's Office sent DNA evidence collected from the scene to a private laboratory in Florida rather than routing it directly to the FBI laboratory at Quantico. Director Patel addressed this on the record. He said the FBI lab would have processed that evidence within days and potentially returned better results. Whatever was in that DNA, whatever biological trace was left behind at Nancy's front door, sat in a private facility while the investigation waited. Dr. Ann Burgess, who has worked alongside federal law enforcement for 5 decades, identified another critical misstep in the early days of this case. The crime scene at Nancy's home was released back to the family within days of the disappearance. That house was subsequently cleaned. Items were moved. And Burgess said something that should stop anyone following this case cold. She said that properly profiling what happened inside that house required access she will now never have. Her exact words were that it is almost impossible to profile based on what we do not know. She needed to see that crime scene. And it is gone. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the union president of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, told reporter Brian Enton that the first week of this investigation was, in his word, chaotic. Detectives not communicating with each other, FBI agents uncertain where to report. A scene so disorganized in its early hours that Cross said the sheriff should have handed the entire case to the FBI from day one. And through all of it, Sheriff Chris Nanos was standing in front of cameras saying he believed Nancy was present, alive, and that they wanted to save her, while his own hands, according to body language analysis from former homicide detective Phil Waters, told a different story. Waters noted that when the sheriff made the statement about Nancy being alive, he was doing what investigators call chopping, a hand gesture associated in interview settings with statements that carry deception. When Nanos shifted to talking about the leads coming in, his hands moved differently. Waters said he hated to say it about a sitting sheriff, but he called the first part of that statement wishful thinking. By day 100 of this investigation, no arrest had been made. No suspect had been publicly named. The tips were still coming in, but according to sources close to the investigation who spoke to Brian Enton, the hard evidence had not converged on a single name. The investigation was not closed, but it was not close. What it did have was this: 2 separate DNA profiles collected from the scene, currently being analyzed through genealogical DNA methods by C.C. Moore, the same forensic genealogist whose work helped identify the Golden State Killer after decades of failed traditional investigation. Each of those 2 profiles represents a separate chance for a match inside a public genealogy database. When that match comes, it will not be a theory. It will be a name. And the people whose DNA was left at that scene may not know that the clock on their anonymity is already running. There is also the man on the porch. Burgess believes he is still connected to the Tucson area, or was at the time the crime was committed. She said that when the FBI released that doorbell footage publicly, everything changed for him. She said a person like that, someone operating on bravado rather than genuine understanding of the risk, becomes terrified the moment they see themselves on a television screen. In her assessment, the day that footage aired was the day he quit whatever job he had, left wherever he was living, and tried to disappear. But Burgess also said something else about him, something specific and actionable. The social world he moves in, the people who would recognize his walk and his build, even through a mask, are likely found on the outskirts. She said investigators looking for someone to identify him should be looking in communities with some level of criminal engagement, and that this individual had likely spent time with sex workers locally. That is not a dramatic guess. That is 50 years of behavioral analysis pointing at a specific social geography. Before we wrap up, there is one detail from this case that still does not sit right. Nancy Guthrie raised 3 children after losing her husband at 46. She stayed in that same house in Tucson for more than half a century. She went to church. She tended her garden. She sat on her porch in the Catalina foothills and watched the desert evenings come in. And inside her chest, right now, is a pacemaker the size of a small matchbox that has been logging every heartbeat since 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, 2026. Every moment of what Nancy has experienced since that night, every heartbeat, every cardiac event, every physiological response is stored inside that device. The only way to access that record is to find her. On Mother's Day, May 10th, 2026, Savannah Guthrie posted a tribute to her mother. She wrote, "Mother, daughter, sister, none, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you." Here is the question I want to leave you with today. Dr. Burgess said the person who planned this crime is local, has inside knowledge of that family's life, and is very likely watching the coverage of this case right now. If that is true, if the puppet master is someone who sat at Nancy Guthrie's dinner table and then had her taken, what does it say about what investigators have been waiting for, and what are they still afraid to say out loud? If this case has been on your mind the way it has been on mine, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to follow this story as it develops, subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because this one is far from over.